Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Ceylon College of Physicians, I'm Himantha Attukorala. Welcome to the second episode of this new series of webinars titled Collegia Unitum Scientia, Colleges United in Science. Today, I'm honored to feature Professor Ravin Hangwella, who will deliver a speech titled Hysteria, Possession States, and Pseudoseizures. I would like to remind our dear viewers that questions will be discussed at the end of the speech, and you could type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. To tell you all about this webinar series of CCP and to further introduce our guest speaker, I cordially invite the President of Ceylon College of Physicians, Professor Arusha Disanayake. Over to you, sir.
Right. Thank you very much, Himantha. One thing is for taking the lead in organizing this lecture. Thank you, Himantha. Thank you very much for the introduction as well. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce the speaker today, a very dear teacher of mine, Professor Ravin Hangwella. Now, taking a minute to explain the purpose of this whole movement, Collegia Unitum Scientia, Colleges United in Science. Now, we know that traditionally we've always collaborated very closely with sister physician colleges, but presently, during 2022, we're trying to reach out to other colleges because we feel that we can learn a lot from the non-traditional sister colleges. The first in this series was the College of Physicians, College of Surgeons President, Dr. Satish Gunasinghe, who gave a talk on urology, which was very, very beneficial to all of us. So for the second session, we've invited Professor Ravin Hangwella from the College of at least a psychiatrist, so that we link up with the psychiatry college as well as the because a vast proportion of our work involves the psychological aspects of patients as well. So with that in mind, we thought we will have the second lecture from Professor Hangwella. Now, Professor Hangwella is the chair professor and senior professor of psychiatry at the Faculty of Medicine, University of Colombo. In addition to that, he has been past president of the College of Psychiatrists. He has been a past chairperson of the Board of Study in Psychiatry. He is a fellow of the College of Psychiatrists of Sri Lanka, the Royal College of Psychiatrists UK, and very importantly to us, he's a fellow of the Ceylon College of Physicians as well. He has served for a number of years on the council of the Ceylon College of Physicians as the representative from the Psychiatry College. And I believe Professor Hangwella is the first CCP council member to become the president of the College of Psychiatrists of Sri Lanka. His academic eminence knows no bounds, and I think these few titles tell us what a top-class academic he is. He has published widely in the medical literature, lots of publications, very, very important, trend-setting, goal-defining publications in psychiatry in Sri Lanka and overseas. So, absolute gem of an academic. And then on a personal note, I've shared many interests with Professor Hangwella. I've learned a lot from him. It has always been greatly stimulating to have a conversation with him on things beyond traditional medicine. And I'm ever grateful to Professor Hangwella for introducing Stoic philosophy to me, which has been a passion for me over the past few years. So on a personal note, also I've gained a lot, and I'm sure all the viewers will also gain a huge amount by listening to Professor Ravin Hangwella, because he is a top-class academic, and the College of Physicians is indeed privileged to be having him as today's speaker. Over to you, sir. A very warm welcome to you. Thank you, sir. Please take over.
Thank you, Arusha. Let me first get my presentation up. Can you hear me all right? Volume is okay?
Yes.
I can hear you well, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay, right. Let me get the presentation up and running. Right. Good evening. And first of all, I must thank the president of the Ceylon College of Physicians, Arusha, and also Dr. Himantha, for going to so much trouble to prepare this beautiful poster for my presentation. This is a topic close to my heart, but surprisingly in my long career in psychiatry, this is the first time I am giving a lecture on this subject. We don't have a regular lecture on this topic in the medical school, or not even in the PGIM. Just to note that in my lecture, I will be changing the order of topics from that given in the poster. I will first talk about, let me see. Yeah, first I will talk about hysteria, then about pseudoseizures, and finally I will go on to possession states, okay? Because in a way it follows that logical sequence. Right, let's get going. Right, so in the history of, well, I'll be covering a bit of history as well, a general history, which are relevant to the topic. In history, there are three people who more or less, I think, have shaken the ego of man. By the way, ego is also a term coined by Freud. First, we have a gentleman called Johannes Kepler, and then came Charles Darwin, and then came Sigmund Freud, who is the person relevant to us today. So why did I say they kind of shook our ego? Well, Kepler showed that the Earth moves around the sun and that we are not the center of the universe. And then came Darwin, who came and said, okay, we are not a special act of creation, and that we too evolved as all of the life forms. And then, of course, came Sigmund Freud, who is the important person for us today. And he really hit us right in the heart of our ego, so to speak. He showed that firstly, we don't own our minds fully. And many a times our minds are not even aware of what we do and feel. And he showed that we are not the masters of our mind as well. Right, so let's look at Freud for a while and his work, because that is relevant for this topic, very much so. This picture actually, which I used for the poster, is from a famous painting done, which shows the famous neurologist, Jean-Marie Charcot, doing hypnosis. So in the late 1800s, he used to demonstrate hypnosis on his patients and show that he could actually, under hypnosis, induce the symptoms the patient had previously. And also under hypnosis, remove the symptoms as well. Now, to his mind, this was a kind of proof that these were actual physical nervous disorders. And in this audience, in 1885, was Sigmund Freud. He took a kind of a leave and went to Paris to see these clinical demonstrations. Interestingly, in this picture, there is Tourette as well. Tourette, Gilles de la Tourette, the man who described Tourette syndrome. He is there as well. I don't know which one is which, but anyway, he's there in the picture, not Sigmund Freud. So let's start with Sigmund Freud and a friend of his called Joseph Breuer. So after or during the time Sigmund Freud went to Paris, he went as a neurologist and came back as a psychiatrist. He was actually not a psychiatrist, he was a neurologist by profession, a pretty good one at that. He wrote some seminal papers on childhood ataxias, and also was the pioneer in the use of cocaine as an anesthetic agent for the eye. Of course, he didn't get the honor for that, somebody else got the honor, but he was the first. So he was a good scientist as well. So he had this older friend, a famous physician in Vienna called Joseph Breuer. And Breuer had this patient who became famous in the literature as Anna O. Now, Freud never saw Anna O actually. He wrote about her, but never saw her in person. Now, Anna O actually is not her name. Her real name is Bertha Pappenheim. Now, Freud had this code where he, in the alphabet, he went backwards one letter and coded the name. So Anna O, the real name was Bertha Pappenheim. So what was the importance of Bertha? Anna O, patient of the neurologist, and the symptoms included a whole heap of hysterical symptoms: amnesia, paralysis, aphonia, hallucinations of snakes, disturbances of memory, loss of ability. In fact, the whole range of hysterical symptoms. And these arose in the context of the death of her father some months ago. And Brewer diagnosed this young lady as having hysteria. And later, Freud with Brewer wrote this famous book, Studies on Hysteria, where he outlined the case. Actually, as I said, Freud never saw this person. He never treated Anna Freud. It's a bit interesting because actually during the course of treatment, Anna O developed what is now called transference for Joseph Brewer. And she kind of fell in love with Joseph Brewer and expressed love for him. Joseph Brewer was rather upset about this and immediately terminated therapy. And it is said that to consolidate his marriage, he went on a second honeymoon. He actually terminated therapy. And she was not treated by him after that. Freud didn't treat her either. But I'll come to her how she ended up later in the day. Let's get on to another story of another girl, another lady, and again two psychiatrists. Freud is there in the middle, and on our left is another gentleman who became famous called Carl Jung. And the lady here is another Russian lady, actually, Sabina Spielrein, and born to a wealthy Jewish family who came to reside in Switzerland. And she also developed a severe hysteria with tics, grimaces, and uncontrolled laughing and crying. And she was admitted to this famous Swiss sanatorium called the Berhorsi Clinic. And there she met Carl Jung, who was assistant to the famous Eugene Bleuler, who was the director at the clinic. And then Carl Jung started treating her and again described the case to Freud, who kind of then going on the case developed the whole foundations of psychoanalysis, so to speak. Interesting story, so Sabina Spielrein. And from this rather interesting story came this film. I don't know if you've ever seen it, a book and a film. It's called The Dangerous Method. And the film, it's a good film. I would recommend that you see it. It's based on a book by another person. And three famous actors and actress was there. So let's see a little excerpt from this film, just to keep you awake.
Sex.
Male.
Family.
Child.
Divorce.
No.
Professor Freud. Dr. Jung.
I've simply opened a door. It's for the young men like yourself to walk through it.
Perhaps she's the one for your experimental treatment.
Tell me about the first time you can remember being beaten by your father.
It's exciting me.
And how is your little Russian patient?
There was the most dramatic improvement.
Is she a virgin?
Almost certainly.
If you ever want to take the initiative, I live in that building there.
Why should we put so much effort into suppressing our most basic natural instincts?
Never repress anything.
I want you to punish me.
There's a rumor running around Vienna that you've taken one of your patients as a mistress.
Surely you didn't think I'd let you go without putting up a fight.
Don't you think we ought to stop?
Do you want to stop?
You still love him?
Will you come back to us now?
Sometimes you have to do something unforgivable just to be able to go on living.
Okay, so that's the film and that's the cover of the DVD. If you want to see it, please do see it. By the way, Arosha, did you hear the sound from the movie? I forgot to share the sound.
Yes,
No,
yes.
we heard. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Okay, right. Right, so let's look at hysteria, and bit of the terminology is rather confusing. So let me take you through that confusing terminology and come to the present day. So hysteria is a rather old term, actually. It originated in the time of the Greeks, actually. So it meant the wandering uterus, as in those days, they thought that the uterus had something to do with all these symptoms. And then, of course, came Charcot, who kind of, I thought hysteria was a physical disorder. And then there was a French psychiatrist, Pierre Janet, who kind of coined the term dissociation for the same condition. This was about at the same time. And then, of course, came Freud, who kind of renamed this conversion disorder. And later in our times, there was a condition called somatization, where you get a large number of somatic symptoms, mainly in females, which was identified as somatization disorder or Briquet syndrome, which now we identify as unexplained medical symptoms or somatization. Now, I won't be talking about that topic today because though connected, it's the whole different area, different in psychopathology, so to speak. So I will not talk about that, but just to orient you as to the terminology. Okay, it's hugely confusing. And of course, the classification that we use now in psychiatry, at least in Sri Lanka, is the British or the WHO classification called ICD-10. And there the hysterical disorders are classified under the term dissociation and conversion disorders. Conversion is still there, but the more newer term is dissociation. Why did they change? Because hysteria has a negative connotation. And so people dropped it actually. Right. So remember that it excludes malingering. Now all these physical symptoms are not simulated consciously by the patient. Remember that, okay? Though you may sometimes doubt it, they are not. And it includes all these other terms: conversion hysteria, conversion reaction hysteria, hysterical psychosis, okay? And this is the definition. These are a bit of jargon here. So the common theme, as they say in the ICD-10, shared by dissociative disorders, or conversion as it was called, is there's a loss of the integration of our normal brain activities between the memories of the past, the awareness of identity, even our own sensations and control of bodily movements. And there is no evidence of physical disorder that would explain the symptoms. So that is the kind of formal definition given. And the final one is interesting. In the ICD-10, this is the only disorder which requires evidence of a psychological causation. Now you might say, hang on, like in psychiatry, in our classification, dissociative disorders is the only condition which requires a psychological explanation. All the other conditions in a classification book do not require etiology, okay? Psychological etiology for diagnosis, but this one requires. Having said that, the DSM-5, the American latest classification, eliminated this need. I think that's a bit of a cop-out, because just because you can find doesn't mean that there isn't. This is one of the cornerstones of the diagnosis. Right. So, and this includes a range of problems, as you can see. So there's amnesia, there is a fugue state, there's stupor, anesthesia, mixed dissociation. But today I will be concentrating on 3 only. You can see in red what we call the dissociative motor disorders, the dissociative convulsions, trance and possession states, which are all forms of hysteria, which are now called dissociative or conversion disorders. So I hope that kind of orients you to the classification, which is rather confusing. Right. So let's look at dissociative motor disorder or hysterical paralysis, which is one of the most interesting of the conditions, and which is, of course, the common variety that we get or used to get in our wards. Having said that, it's not so common now. I wonder why is that, because I suppose these change with times. When we were students and trainees, we had a number of patients coming in every week. But now it's a bit difficult even to find for teaching purposes. So they have all the weakness of paralysis of limbs, sometimes vocal disorders, aphonias, dysphagia, choking sensation in the throat. And these symptoms are rather erratic, unstable, change from time to time. And sometimes these paralyzed limbs might move when the attention is shifted, but that doesn't mean the patient is malingering. Please note that, okay? They are not malingering. However, they are not consistent. So the amount of paralysis or like anesthesia might change from time to time. So these are indications that these are not organic conditions. And just remember that this is a diagnosis of positive diagnosis. We do not exclude all other physical problems and then diagnose hysterical paralysis. That is not a way to go about it, and would be a tremendous waste of medical resources to do that. But having said that, often these patients move through other specialties and then only come to the psychiatric unit. It is not common for them to kind of appear directly in our units because patients do not realize, of course, that these are due to mental condition. Even doctors don't realize. So they do all sorts of tests. Unfortunately, and even nowadays, of course, the MRI scan is done invariably before they come to us. So I think the lesson is that we should not do that really. We must diagnose positively, even the non-psychiatrists. Okay, just to pick up your interest again, a short video again featuring Freud. I don't know the source of this video actually, I picked it from the internet. And here Freud is examining a classic case of hysterical paralysis, okay?
Baroness, may I present Dr. Freud? A young colleague and lecturer in neuropathology who has recently returned from a 6-month visit to the Salpêtrière.
So, you have been working under my beloved Charcot. Do tell me, is his wife still fornicating with hussars?
I failed to inquire, madame. Dr. Freud has brought with him some equipment modeled on the latest developments in electrotherapy from Paris.
Indeed. Charmant.
And how is the arm today?
The arm is clay, unfeeling. But the pain here in my cheeks has gone. I feel it like a slap sometimes. A slap that stays and glows. A slap I may have deserved, but never received. Strange. I dreamt I was a statue last night. I'd forgotten. A statue of the Madonna. A plaster statue by the roadside.
If you'll permit me, Baroness.
And the Emperor rode by. He had my father's face. He raised his hat and I heard him say, "Hail, Diana the Huntress!" Oh, it made me laugh to think of it when I woke up. And yet, there was something in his tone. He had my father's voice, deliberate, mocking, as if there was some meaning in the way he said it. Diana. Anna. My name is Anna. You may begin.
Okay, you may be a bit surprised that Freud is using an electric machine, but actually that's historically true actually. Before he developed hypnosis, he actually used this machine for paralysis, but not quite well known, but that's true. That's true actually. Right, okay. So how did Freud conceptualize conversion disorder? So these were his kind of diagnostic criteria, which are still true actually. One of the few things that Freud said that are still valid actually. Right, the patient has a psychological conflict that leads to neurotic anxiety. I will explain this a little later. That anxiety, which is actually not the anxiety that we know in physiology, this is a neurotic anxiety, this is a psychic anxiety, is resolved by converting this the conflict into a physical deficit, which is called the primary gain. And then the usual social reinforcement that a patient gets once they have a deficit is called the secondary gain. So the paralysis is maintained by the secondary gain. And due to the conversion of anxiety, the patient appears indifferent to the disability. I think you would have seen some of these things in that little film. She is kind of quite happy and laughing in spite of a paralyzed arm. So that was called, in French, la belle indifference. I don't know how to pronounce it, but it means beautiful indifference. So the patient appears quite not unaware, but they are not very unhappy. So what the theory is that their anxiety and their distress is now converted into this physical symptom. So you might ask, well, hang on, like if you remove the symptom, does the distress come back? Yes, actually, we are seeing that when people shed their disability, they become depressed. So there is some truth to this Freud's viewpoint. Now, this, of course, a classic condition, and we have seen many of these kind of patients in our ward. And this is our opportunity for doing miracles, as they say. I can still remember way back in my early training, there's a patient, a boy, referred to our unit by the late Professor Dharmadasa, Professor of Medicine. So he came in the morning to the ward, referred by Professor Dharmadasa, and he came in a wheelchair. And sometime in the afternoon, I was there in the ward, and Professor Dharmadasa was going past the ward 59. And those of the old timers will remember that Ward 59 those days had a little badminton court in front, like where the patients sit now. There's a badminton court. So this patient was actually playing badminton. And Professor Dharmadasa was passing the ward, and to his shock, he found this boy whom he had referred in the morning in a wheelchair, now playing badminton in the afternoon. So he came into the ward, I can still remember. And he knew me, of course, where I was his intern house officer, and said, I refer this patient in the morning in a wheelchair, and now he's playing badminton. And he nodded and went his way. Well, so that's how it went. Like that was our chance to impress the medics. Right, a few questions coming up, but I'll hold those for the end, okay? Right. Right, so how do we manage conversion disorder? We don't use electrotherapy or psychotherapy or psychoanalysis nowadays. Our method is far more mundane. So firstly, we look and eliminate any psychiatric disorders, exclude rather. So there are some patients who develop these problems because of severe depression and other psychosis. So they have to be treated for those conditions. Most often they don't have any of these actually. So firstly, we actually don't pay very much attention to the physical deficit. So in technical terms, we call it reducing reinforcement. And also we get the bystander. Very difficult in our context to kind of not help out the patient too much. So if the patient is paralyzed, don't bring everything to the foot of the patient. Let them get their food and drink, kind of we keep it by the side of the bed. And then of course, we do explore the stressors and conflicts which led to the problem. There's always a stress and a conflict. It doesn't arise in isolation, as I said. So we talk about that rather than the physical problem. And that is called changing the agenda. So Professor Samarsing's term is changing the agenda. Actually, this is his kind of teaching. So shift the focus from the pseudo problem to the real problem. And that's called changing the agenda. And we talk about how we can actually manage his or her real problems. And very often with this kind of approach, the physical problems go away, okay? They vanish. Of course, if you want to be very dramatic, we can use hypnosis and reduce the problems in a minute. Very nice to impress medical students and others, but the problem there is, of course, sometimes in another 1 hour, the symptom comes back, like, and that doesn't really solve the problem, but good for the show, I suppose. Right, but we don't really use that. And of course, lastly, work with the patient to enhance their coping skill. So that's the rather mundane management of conversion disorder, any type of conversion disorder. Okay, not only paralysis. Right, sometimes the physical deficit may need physiotherapy. Right. It's called, we don't really call it pseudophysiotherapy, but we do exercise the limbs. Remember now, if this patient has had a paralysis for a long, long time, there may be actual atrophy of the muscles, so they may actually need physiotherapy. I remember this boy, I think he was about 11 years old, who had been paralyzed for 1 year and not gone to school for 1 year. And it was a dissociative paralysis. Of course, all the possible investigations have been done, and he was paralyzed and he had atrophy of the limbs, and finally ended up in our ward. It took 2 months of physiotherapy to get him back on his feet, but he did go back to school. So we can also do miracles and make people walk. And I suppose at the end of the day, I think one problem I come across, people are really suspicious of people with conversion. They think, hang on, can they really have physical symptoms? Can the mind really cause physical symptoms? Or are they somehow conning, even though you say it's unconscious, it's not really unconscious? Now, let me tell you, they are not conning. The mind can really cause physical changes in our body. And the syndrome that well illustrates this point is it's a kind of syndrome, you may not have heard about it, but I'm sure the cardiologists would know. But I wonder, have they found any such cases in Sri Lanka? It's an interesting condition called the broken heart syndrome. It's called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. Takotsubo was not the person who discovered it. It is actually named after a octopus catching vase used in Japan called Takotsubo. And the heart develops this kind of shape. And how does this come about? Well, severe stress causes stimulation of certain adrenal nerve endings, which are more prevalent in the kind of the upper end and the lower part of the heart, and they cause the heart to take on this shape. And there is actual damage to the heart, actually. And if you do an echo, you might find that the kind of echo, the cardiac functions are reduced by more than 50%. Okay. And here's a case illustration of a lady who developed the Takotsubo syndrome. 1 week after the death of the husband from dementia, she developed chest pain, shortness of breath, distended neck pain, sweaty brow, and noticeable panting even while sitting. And on echo, there was a 50% reduction in the ejection fraction. All the tests were normal. And 2 weeks later, everything came back to normal once the emotional state returned to normal. So that's the supreme illustration of how the mind can really cause problems with the physical state of our body. Okay, they can also return to normal. So there are reported conditions which cause this Takotsubo syndrome, broken heart syndrome, grief, of course, public speaking, gambling losses, domestic disputes, and surprise birthday parties. So do be careful next time. You might cause the broken heart syndrome. Okay, right. Okay, we are done with conversion. Just sidetrack a bit to an interesting condition called mass hysteria. You can even get a community of people developing these symptoms wholesale, and that's an interesting condition. So let's go back a bit. In the Middle Ages, there was something called St. Vitus dance, where people got into this state where they started dancing in a lot of people in chapels dedicated to St. Vitus. Don't ask me why it's St. Vitus. But later, of course, St. Vitus became the patron saint of dancing. And then later, Sydenham, chorea is the Latin term for dancing. So Sydenham described chromatic chorea and called it St. Vitus's dance. And that's the connection. So that was also a kind of a historical kind of epidemic hysteria, as it's called. So this is a mass hysteria occurring in large groups of people. And this is actually a case report of such a mass hysteria occurring in Sri Lanka. I don't know whether you remember that this was 2012, actually, 10 years ago. 1,900 school children in 15 schools across Sri Lanka developed a range of symptoms that look like allergic reactions, skin rash, vomiting, vertigo, and cough. And so it started from a school in Gampol, actually. and ended up with 1,900 school children from 15 schools being affected. I can remember the director general calling us for a meeting and asking what to do. Well, with a kind of very rational handling by the ministry, these things vanished in a week, So we can see that historically these things can happen. Okay, right. So let's move on to the next topic, pseudoseizures. And now I'm going to show you 3 videos. And you can guess which one is the true one and which ones are the false ones, okay? It's not that easy. So let's see the first video. Okay, so that's the first video. This is the second one. Okay, number 3.
They first encountered the evil Bill and Ted.
Ignore the background. That's a TV going on, okay? So don't worry about that.
How's it going, Bill and Ted? Ted, just again. How's it going, Bill? Not bad, Bill. And you? We came to help you guys in the most unfortunate situation.
Come on, Bill.
Now, come with us. We'll show you. Okay.
Come on.
Excuse us. Dude. I gotta leave you here. Why?
Here, come on. Come on.
So it wasn't your previous intervention.
Okay, I wonder whether you guess correctly. One is a true seizure, other 2 are pseudoseizures, okay? So anyway, I can't poll you now, but the last one is the true one. I'm now going to play it with the video EEG running parallel. Okay, you can see the, sorry.
In this scene, they first encountered the evil Bill and Ted. How's it going, Bill and Ted? Ted, just again. How's it going, Bill? Not bad, Bill. You? Man. We came to help you guys in the most unfortunate situation.
Come on, Doc. Come on,
How? Come with us. We'll show you. Okay.
Come on.
Excuse us. Dude.
Okay, come on.
I gotta leave you here. Why? I don't know.
Here, come on. Come on. Let's go. Let's go. Come on.
Ted, so it wasn't your previous intervention that you just saw. We were past him. Held up the bed. Another excellent human time.
Okay, in that there are some muscle artifacts as well, but you can clearly see the EEG becoming quite bizarre towards the end. Right. So this is a classic question. How do we differentiate true from what we now call psychogenic non-epileptic seizures? The term pseudoseizure is also considered to be not a very good term to use because they are not actually pretending to have seizures. Okay, these are psychogenic, but they are not pseudo in that sense. Right, so these are some of the differences between true seizure and a pseudoseizure. So the age is a bit different. Now pseudoseizures are more in the older age groups. Females are more common, previous psychiatric history, of course, present. The movements are different. In psychogenic seizures, there's more flailing, thrashing, side-to-side head movements, pelvic thrusting, whereas the other one is more classical of a general conversion. The vocalization, well, I don't think there are differences really. Incontinence is more likely in epileptic seizure, but not totally absent in psychogenic seizures, note that. And even tongue and injury to tongue and so forth are more frequent, but not again absent in psychogenic seizures. Epileptic seizures, amnesia is common. And of course, they are unconscious during the seizure, whereas during psychogenic seizures, they are conscious. Suggestions provoke the seizure, no, in epilepsy, but psychogenic seizure, suggestion will induce a seizure. Right, okay. Having said that, it's not very easy. Sometimes some patients have both epileptic and non-epileptic seizures together because they have learned actually from the true seizure how to develop psychogenic seizures, not consciously, again, unconsciously. So this mixed category is the most difficult to differentiate from each other. I think one clue is that if a perfectly stable patient with epilepsy suddenly becomes resistant to medicines and keep escalating the dose, then that may be an indication. And also the psychogenic seizures are different in character to the true seizures. Okay, so that will give a clue, but still very difficult. So just a little conversation between a famous psychiatrist and a famous neurologist. So on our left is David Goldberg, and on our right, Dr. Brian Toon, former consultant neurologist at Maudsley. This is old video, so now both these gentlemen are retired now, but they are discussing the differences between epileptic and non-epileptic seizures. So let's listen briefly, not to the whole clip, but maybe a part of it. Interesting one anyway.
Ask you about patients who have pseudoseizures. Are there ever any diagnostic difficulties in deciding whether a seizure is a pseudoseizure or a real one?
Yes, I think it can be a very difficult diagnosis, differential diagnosis to make. First of all, because quite a lot of pseudoseizures occur in patients who already have epilepsy, and therefore you have to make a distinction between which is which and what proportion are pseudoseizures and which proportion aren't. That, of course, is going to affect your own anticonvulsant treatment as well as any psychiatric treatment.
Sure. So the same patient can have both sorts of seizures?
Indeed they can. Indeed they can. Right. And they can be particularly difficult to diagnose, the pseudoseizures in that sort of situation, because the patient already has a model of epilepsy on which they draw, albeit subconsciously.
Sure.
I think the second problem is that pseudoseizures can very closely mimic epileptic seizures. Textbooks classically list various distinguishing features, but in practice, very few of these features, such as tongue biting, incontinence, and so on, are all that helpful. One can see these features in patients with pseudoseizures.
So you can actually witness an attack and still have difficulty, can you?
Oh, indeed. Indeed, we regularly video many of our attacks, but we often have great difficulty in agreeing or in getting it right.
And is a person having a pseudoseizure consciously malingering?
In the great majority of instances, no, they're not. They're not malingering. They're not themselves aware of any difference between an epileptic seizure and a pseudoseizure. From their point of view, from their experience, they are identical.
So it's a hysterical dissociative state?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
And how do you investigate it?
I think that it's very important to get a good clinical history and, if possible, to obtain a video of the attack itself. That's extremely useful. I think that if you have the EEG facilities, then to carry out what we describe as telemetry, which is a long-running EEG accompanied by a video, over a period of as long as it requires for the patient to have an attack, which may be hours, maybe sometimes days. But if you can capture an attack on EEG accompanied by the video description of that attack, then that is extremely useful and can provide you with a diagnosis in a great majority of cases.
So that's a 24-hour recording?
Sometimes more than that.
Sometimes more, okay. And if telemetry is not available?
If telemetry is not available, then one can use prolactin measures following a seizure. At about 20 minutes after a seizure, prolactin levels will go up very considerably and take about 3 or 4 hours to come back to normal. And if you can capture values during that time period, then that can be helpful, certainly in diagnosing pseudoseizures that have the appearance of major seizures. But complex partial seizures, the genuine complex partial seizure, doesn't necessarily produce a rise in prolactin levels.
So it's not entirely reliable.
It's not entirely reliable, no.
Okay. Now, supposing we reach the stage of deciding that somebody does have pseudoseizures, how do you manage them?
Okay, let's go on to the management. Okay, this is how we manage. This is the same kind of orders for the pseudoseizures are also part of conversion, so in a way, so similar. Again, we look for any underlying psychiatric disorder or true epilepsy and exclude. Of course, some can have a concurrent epilepsy. Often helpful to observe a seizure or get a video. Sometimes we ask the relations to take a video if we are not there. Neurological examination during the seizure is also useful. The plantars are different. Blood for prolactin can be drawn, but as Dr. Toom said, it may not be that distinguishing always. We try not to pay too much attention to seizures. Again, we reduce reinforcement, as it's called. Again, we concentrate on the actual stressors and conflicts which led to the problem rather than the seizure. So again, it's what we call change of agenda, shifting from the real pseudo problem to the real problem, okay? And finally, enhancing coping skills. Often these people have some difficulties with coping in a constructive way. We've had people, especially in domestic abuse, the wife or the female partner develops pseudoseizures. That's a common thing. Maybe it's their way of coping because sometimes the partner, sometimes, but not always, becomes a bit more kindly towards the partner when they're having these seizures because they're ill now. Of course, they go back to the abusive ways once they recover. So recovery also means giving the partner additional coping skills without having a seizure to cope with a real problem. So this is how we deal with pseudoseizures. Okay, right, we are done with that. Now let's go on to the last part, which is not actually a psychiatric condition. It's called possession states, but we do come across this in our psychiatric practice. Why did I say it's not a psychiatric problem? Though it is mentioned in the ICD-10 in a corner, they would say, okay, all possession states are not coming into your realm. Okay, but never mind. It's an interesting condition. And in fact, for the Christians here might remember, in the Bible, it is all mentioned, several passages are there referring to demonic possession. So this I extract from the New Testament, the Gospels, Luke chapter 8. So here it describes how Jesus stepping onto the shore met a demon-possessed man from the town and asked his name, and he said, Legion. Legion is, of course, in Roman military terms, is a number. I think it's about 1,000, I think, in a legion, and had many demons in him. And the demons begged Jesus not to order them to go out into the abyss. Of course, the demons came out of the man and went into the pigs, and the whole herd rushed down and drowned. Unfortunate for the herdsmen, of course, and the pigs. Well, that's the story from the Bible. So in those times also, the demonic possession and casting out of evil spirits was an acceptable phenomenon and kind of acceptable. And of course, the tradition has come down mainly in the Catholic Church. And some of you all, again, this is a very old film, actually, came in 1973, The Exorcist. They say scariest movie of all time. I don't know about that. But it is one of the highest grossing horror films of all time. And in fact, the first horror film to be nominated for Best Picture. It didn't win it, but it was nominated. And it's also reported that many people developed actual heart attacks and even a miscarriage while watching the film. So maybe it's available on DVD, so maybe have a look at it. It's actually based on a true story of a boy who was exorcised by 2 Roman Catholic priests. In the film, of course, it's a female. Right, okay, let's look at what the ICD-10 tells about trance and position states. There's a temporal loss of both the sense of personal identity and full awareness of the surroundings. And in some instances, the individual acts as if taken over by another personality, spirit, or deity or force. And ICD-10 would say, look, for us, you will look at only people where it occurs outside religious or other culturally acceptable situations. Of course, that's a very relative term. Right. Not many of our textbooks actually look at this in detail. And one book that does is this famous book by Sir William Trethewey. Of course, the new authors, this is the 4th edition, not William Trethewey. So there it says the position state can be defined as the presence of a belief, delusional or otherwise, held by an individual that their symptoms, experiences, and behavior under the influence or control of supernatural forces, often of diabolical origin. Okay, they are not pleasant forces. You normally get possessed by a diabolical force. And at the last, they add this rather, I don't know, the statement, we make no judgment concerning the absolute reality or not of demonic possession. So don't ask me, well, some of my patients do actually ask me, doctor, do you believe in ghosts? Like, you know, well, after 30 years of psychiatry, I have yet to meet a true demonic possession, but I will leave it at that. So in fact, trance and possession states, there are several types. So on your left upper, you get the true possession states that are the realm of the psychiatrist, so to speak. And then, of course, the various psychoses can mimic possession states. And then there are, of course, the religious and culturally sanctioned possession states. And of course, there are states of physical disorders and psychoactive substance use disorders that can, again, mimic trance and possession states. So all these are possession states. Okay. Now, not many papers on the subject in Sri Lanka, but there are a few. So I will just take you through a few. This one is a very early one by C.P. Vijayasinghe Disanayak and Mendis. Interesting because C.P. Vijayasinghe, professor of psychiatry, senior lecturer S.A.W. Disanayak, and lecturer in Mendis. The last two became the chairs, one after the other. And I'm the 4th chair, actually. So the 3 professors are here in this paper. Another one by the professor in Jaffna, the former professor, Daya Somasundaram, and Dinesh Bukra. And the third one, yours truly and my colleagues in the department, written some years ago, actually. We described 3 cases of possession. And it was interesting because the 3 cases were from 3 different religious backgrounds. So that's why we got the services of Alam Yusuf, who is now one of our students. Now he's a successful GP in Melbourne. And so he helped out with the Muslim perspective, Islam, and the Buddhist and the Christian perspective. So they had different religions, and their religious backgrounds colored the what you call the clinical presentation. And in fact, one person actually had, well, thought she was actually communicating with people from previous births, actually. So we had the case of, well, that's also another aspect of possession. Some people believe they have now become possessed, or they're speaking in like one of their previous births. Does it mean there's reincarnation? Well, I don't think so again. Yet to come across true incarnation in my career, but I pass no judgment on that. Right, okay. So how do we manage possession states? Now, of course, culturally, there are traditional methods of managing possession. So let's look at a few videos again. So this exorcism in the Christian context. I have muted the audio because for preserving confidentiality. Right, okay. Observe the movements of the patient carefully. All right. Now you will see that I've taken a still from that movie. On the left and on your right is a old picture from the salpetry. That's where Charcot practiced. And here you can see a male patient diagnosed as having hysteria, manifesting the same posture. We call it ophistotonus in technical jargon. And of course, there are other conditions where you can get this type of arching of the back. But they're not having tetanus, they're having hysterical seizure. So you can see the similarity, okay? Right. Another one is the traditional Towil ceremony, which again, you would have. It's actually not quite common nowadays, but used to be quite common in the South especially. So let's have a look at that. Yeah, right. So this is a bit interesting because how it's done is normally I think you saw the patient or the person possessed was near the doorstep of the house. The Katandia takes on the evil spirit from the patient and then he gets possessed by the spirit. And usually the Katandia runs to a cemetery and there the spirit is taken out. Quite exhausting for the Katandia, I think. So that's how it's done in the cultural context. Right, another interesting method that are used by my mentor in the South, Dr. D.V.J. Harishchandra. And actually, I think he coined the term actually. And in fact, Dr. Tolusha, his daughter, cardiothoracic surgeon, actually mentioned that in a web comment. It's a term originally coined by Dr. D.V.J. Harishchandra and discussed in his interesting book. I think all of you all should read it, Psychiatric Aspects of Jataka Stories. And there he also mentions possession states and paranormal activity, including werewolves. That's interesting. Now, I don't have a video of Dr. Harishchandra doing a hypnoexorcism, unfortunately, but I do have another video of a Buddhist monk doing hypnoexorcism. Just a bit of warning, right at the end, there's a rather blood-curdling scream, so please lower your volume, otherwise your eardrums might get shattered. Okay, I did warn you about that. Right, so that's a hypnoexorcism. Harishchandra also did something similar where he actually, of course, he didn't take on the spirit himself. He actually kind of got the patient to see the spirit in front of them. And he got the patient to tell the spirits to go away and never come back. Quite dramatic and quite successful as well. Of course, we don't do any of these exotic things. Here's another case where we challenged, or we kind of handled one of these possession states, and I wrote about it to the local newspaper. Due to lack of time, I won't go into details. And well, here's how we manage possession states. No dramatics here. Same principles here. We look for a primary underlying psychiatric disorder and exclude. We don't pay too much attention to the possession state, actually. We ignore it, actually. We don't ask too many questions about who is the devil or the yaka or whatever. That's called reducing reinforcement. We explore the stresses and conflicts which led to the problem. Again, we shift from the real problem to the real problem, from the pseudo problem. It's called changing the agenda, if you remember. And lastly, work with the patient to enhance coping skills. Often these patients have other problems and they're actually using or manifesting these spirits, in fact, to increase their power. And we have this classic situation where the kind of the abused partner, the female usually, starts speaking in the voice of a dead grandfather or grandmother and frightens the partner to death, really, and then he stops abusing her. But the problem is, I mean, once you remove the spirit, then what happens? Okay, so again, we have to have some help for the patient. Otherwise, the patient will find it advantageous to keep the spirit rather than getting rid of the spirit plays a role in their life, right? Okay, right. And the other problem with traditional methods is that they are rather expensive, actually. So full tovili will cost quite a lot nowadays. And there are some dangers as well. And we have often come across patients burned quite badly because of the resin or the dummala that is spread by the katandia, sprayed onto the patient, actually. And of course, recently you would have, you remember there was a death of a 9-year-old girl during an exorcism ceremony where she was struck with a stick, I think. Okay, so there are dangers, and our methods, though less dramatic, are much less dangerous and much cheaper as well. So, but really, I would really not go with traditional methods, really. Okay, but the problem is patients do not look on these problems as psychiatric problems. So obviously, why would they come to the psychiatrist for exorcisms? So that's a problem we have. Right. There's something called false memory syndrome, but because time is running short, I'm going to actually skip this, not strictly relevant for my talk. So let's go on and wind up. Right, okay. Any good story must have ending, so we must be wondering what happened to Anna O. Well, she did recover completely, actually, from her illness. Not due to any wonderful treatment by Brewer. As you remember, he gave up treatment. Bertha Pappenheim, or Anna, went on to become a famous social worker in Germany. And in 1954, the German issued a stamp, actually bearing her image in recognition of her many accomplishments. Okay, so that's a happy ending for Anna, Bertha Pappenheim. What happened to Sabina Spielrein, the other lady? Well, that turned out rather different. She also recovered fully, actually, from her condition. She became assistant to Carl Jung, and that's when things went wrong. She had a romantic relationship with him, which thoroughly was disapproved of by Freud. She studied medicine, became a doctor, and became one of the first psychoanalysts in the world, actually, and made a significant contribution to psychoanalysis. But unfortunately, things didn't end well. She went back to her native town of Rostov-on-the-Don in southern Russia. And when Germany invaded Russia in 1942, she and her 2 daughters were actually taken to the local synagogue and shot to death by a Nazi death squad for the crime of being Jews. Well, that's how the world goes, I suppose. sometimes you can do everything to, well, to be happy, but the circumstances dictate otherwise. Okay, right. So I am coming to the end of my presentation now, and I'm going to leave it with the words of Sigmund Freud to Carl Jung. This is from a film, extract from the film Dangerous Method. Quite important actually. So listen carefully to what Freud says to Jung. Right, because when Carl Jung met Sigmund Freud for the first time on the 3rd of March 1907, they talked for 13 hours. But some years later, 6 years later actually, when they met at the psychoanalytic conference in Munich, 1913, they didn't speak a single word. So there was a rift and they didn't speak to each other after that. Right, because Freud disagreed with Carl Jung. Okay, so let's hear Sigmund Freud.
You mustn't think I have a closed mind. I have absolutely no objection to your studying telepathy or parapsychology to your heart's content. But I would make the point that our own field is so embattled that it can only be dangerous to stray into any kind of mysticism. Don't you see, we have to stay within the most rigorously scientific confines. You all right?
Yes, but I can't agree with you. Why should we draw some arbitrary line and rule out whole areas of investigation?
Precisely because the world is full of enemies, looking for any way they can to discredit us. And the moment they see us abandon the firm ground of sexual theory to wallow in the black mud of superstition, they will pounce. As far as I'm concerned, even to raise these subjects is professional suicide.
I knew that was going to happen.
What?
I felt something like that was going to happen. I had a kind of burning in my stomach.
What are you talking about? It's the heating. The wood in the bookcase just cracked, that's all.
No, it's what's known as a catalytic exteriorization phenomenon.
A what?
A catalytic exteriorization phenomenon.
Don't be ridiculous.
My diaphragm started to glow red hot.
Look, I know it's late.
And another thing. It's going to happen again.
What?
In a minute, it's going to happen again.
My dear young friend, this is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. You must promise.
You see?
That's just... You really can't be serious.
There are so many mysteries. So much further to go.
Please, we can't be too careful. We can't afford to wander into these speculative areas. Telepathy, singing bookcases, fairies at the bottom of the garden. It won't do. It won't do.
Okay, I've come to the end of my presentation. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for that fascinating presentation. It did take me back to the Colombo Med School days where we listened to your very interesting lectures. We have a few questions, so I have selected some of the questions that we have had
okay,
over 15 questions now.
Yeah.
So I'll read out some of the questions so that you could answer them,
Yeah.
please, sir. So
Okay.
the first question that I have selected is hypnosis an evidence-based practice today?
Right, well, yes and no. Well, we don't use it in traditional psychiatry. I don't think we teach it to our trainees either. However, there is a basis to it, and there are some people who are pretty good at hypnosis. The problem is you have to do it very carefully. I mean, if medical hypnosis is acceptable, and even not only psychiatrists, even dentists use it for anesthesia during dental procedures, and it can supplement standard anesthesia. So it has its uses, but it can be easily be abused as well. So I think that there's a bit of fear in psychiatrists to get into these areas. Having said that, I have used hypnosis myself, but I mean, you can use the traditional methods as effectively. So it's kind of an exotic method that is useful and also has some value in understanding the human mind. So I won't say there's no basis to it. There is a basis, but it has to be used correctly. And I suppose if you are good at it, then use it. But Freud was a hopeless hypnotist, actually. So that's why he gave up in hypnosis and went into free association. He was not a good hypnotist at all. So he gave it up, but that doesn't mean it can't be used. Yes, it can be used. And Dr. D.V.J. Harishchandra, the late Dr. Harishchandra, was a master at hypnosis. So he used it quite effectively in therapy as well. Yes.
There's another question on hypnosis. Now, sir, you have mentioned that hypnosis effects are of short duration. Doesn't it have long-term effects?
Yeah, but if you remove hysterical kind of or dissociation with hypnosis and do nothing else, the symptom comes back. So, I mean, often I have used in aphonias, and by evening, the symptom is back again. So that's a problem. Quite dramatic and good for the show, as I said, but doesn't really have a long-lasting effect where the underlying condition is not dealt with. Of course, in a stage show, it might be fine, and it doesn't have, as far as I know, any kind of serious damage doesn't happen. But in a clinical context, it can be not very long-lasting. So that's a problem. Yes.
There's another question on how reliable is the use of prolactin levels to differentiate an actual seizure from a pseudoseizure? Do we use it routinely in clinical practice?
Well, not really, though it's kind of mentioned in the textbooks. And if you listen to that dialogue between Dr. Brian Toon,
yes.
What you said was it's not always reliable. In the classic seizures versus the pseudo seizures, it can be useful, but then not 100%. You have to go with the other features of that particular patient, okay, not a single criteria. But once you add up everything together, then the evidence is strong either way. You have to look at all the features together, and the collective evidence is what we look at, not one isolated feature, but it helps, yes.
So there's a question from a listener from all the way from Bhutan, sir. Greetings from Bhutan. My question is, how do we differentiate dissociation from psychosis? It is quite difficult to understand, especially in our culture where dissociation seems to be quite a common phenomenon. Also from the detailed lecture, I heard many schizophrenia cases are actually being diagnosed with dissociation. So he has this question of differentiating dissociation.
Okay, well, two things. I mean, dissociation can occur in the context of schizophrenia as well. It can be a part of schizophrenia. In fact, all psychosis can manifest any of the other lesser or what we call the neurotic conditions as a part of that main condition, okay? So it's a bit tricky. So the important thing that you have to treat the major problem, because unless you do that, the minor problem won't work. As for differentiating, well, of course, the symptoms or the diagnostic criteria for the major condition has to be fulfilled. So once you do that, you know the person has schizophrenia. So the diagnosed schizophrenia, there are certain criteria, major criteria, minor criteria, those have to be fulfilled. So on top of that, if you get dissociative symptoms, that's okay. That's not a primary dissociation. That's a condition that is secondary to the schizophrenia. So in schizophrenia, you can get any of the milder conditions, anxiety, obsessive disorder, depression, everything. So, but the primary condition has to be treated and diagnosed. You can't miss that and treat the conversion. So there's no really differentiation between the two. If you diagnose schizophrenia and there's conversion, that's a part of the schizophrenia. Okay, so it's not a case of this or that. Of course, if there's somebody with only conversion, don't mix that up with schizophrenia, because really you should not use antipsychotics here. And that won't happen if you stick to the criteria. So obviously a person with only conversion won't have the classic delusions and the person hallucinations and all that of schizophrenia. They don't have that, right? Yeah.
So there's this interesting question on, do you think Kattadias here are dissociating, or is it malingering?
Even the Kattadia, right? Okay. Well, as I said, the part of the ceremony is to take on the spirit of the patient onto the Kattadia. So are they actually dissociating at that point or malingering? I really don't know, really. I suppose some of them may actually get into a state of dissociation themselves. because the amount of physical activity shown is quite inhuman sometimes. And unless they are really in that state, I don't think they can do all that sort of gyrations. They have to be incredibly physically fit, of course, if you observe. And after that episode, they are quite exhausted, some of them, right? Yeah. So I think that's a difficult question. I'm sure they get into some sort of state, I'm sure. Yeah.
Does the family history, educational level, cultural background have an impact on dissociation, conversion, depersonalization, and pseudoseizures? So it's a long question. So,
yeah, it definitely does. So that's a problem. So you have to look at the context. So any symptom, if understood in the context of the patient's background, will be different. So for example, just a conversion in the West would become a possession state in the East if you believe in ghosts or spirits. But if you don't, then it becomes just what you call in the America, they called it the multiple personality disorder, like, where people can change their personalities and speak in different voices. So in the novels and crime novels, the good person becomes an evil person because they have a dissociation of their personality, dissociative identity disorder, as it's called. But if you are looking at it in a cultural context, you might say, well, no, that person has been possessed by the devil. So Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, so to speak, was Mr. Hyde the devil, or was it the same person behaving differently at different times because of some psychic problem? So it's just the way you look at it. So the symptoms are the same, and the way you look at it may change and color the picture. So it's very much cultural, yes. Unlike schizophrenia and the major psychiatric disorders, which are not colored so much by the environment. Okay. Yeah.
There's another question on can hypnosis be used to remove gender dysphoria?
Oh, no, no way. In fact, there are no known therapies to remove gender dysphoria. Okay. Yeah, and in fact, you might get sued also if you try to do that. There's quite a lot of opposition to any therapy for gender dysphoria. Okay, it's a case of understanding and helping them cope. We don't try to change. Yeah.
So, from a psychiatrist point of view, there's a question like, are these disorders caused by an imbalance of certain hormones or chemicals?
Well, I mean, you can get organic conditions causing similar picture, but they are not all caused by hormones or organic problems. Most of them are into psychological problems. Okay, so if you investigate, they have no problem. Everything's normal. But I suppose there are conditions under which toxic substances can cause the brain to malfunction and manifest similar symptoms. So that's why I said the possession states, there are several types. So it depends, but the more common ones are not due to any hormonal or other problem, really. Their physical state is normal.
So, Professor Arosha also has a question.
So thank you very much for a fascinating talk. And then I know how it's very early in the morning for you. It must be about 1 o'clock in the morning for you.
Yeah, 1:20.
For your commitment. And then, of course, we've had a massive audience despite the power interruptions, and then a large number of questions, so which reflects how interesting your talk has been. So my question is a little away from the subject, but on something which you mentioned now, as in differentiating between the true seizures and the pseudoseizures or non-epileptic seizures. One of the criteria you mentioned was suggestion. If it's suggestible, it could become pseudoseizure, more suggestive. I've always had this doubt, sir, about how ethical it is to do a suggestion, because the way I understand suggestion is that we go and tell the patient, okay, I'm going to give you, this thing to drink, and if you're, this drink is going to bring about a seizure. And of course, we may be able to diagnose pseudoseizure, but in the process, we will be telling a downright lie to the patient. So I always wonder whether, from an ethical perspective, whether this is something we should do, though we have the best interest patient at heart, whether this is really acceptable. I would value your opinion on this.
Yeah, it's a bit. We in the psychiatry unit we don't use suggestion really. Also, we don't induce seizures in our patients just to see whether it's genuine. But having said that, I remember that in the neurology unit, of course, I'm not criticizing, but very often one of our senior neurologists used to induce seizures to kind of differentiate the two before referring to us. So I can well remember they giving a pill and telling a placebo and say, now you will get a seizure when you swallow this pill. And immediately the patient kind of, if it's a psychogenic seizure, goes into a seizure state, and then it's okay, refer this person to the psychiatry unit, like, so that's okay, because I think they didn't know how to differentiate. But you are right in a way. I think that could be a bit of problematic. And also suggestion and causing symptoms in patients are quite dangerous actually. That's why in fact they called it the dangerous method actually, because that can have a quite serious effects really historically. Even Carl Jung, I think, found that to his grief actually, and that's why Freud didn't actually approve of Jung's methods really. Right, so you can get into big trouble. And of course, the false memory syndrome, which I couldn't go into because of time, was also a problem where therapists induced memories of sexual abuse, which never happened. And that led to a lot of court cases in America where innocent people went to jail actually. And so that was a big disaster. So that's a problem. So I think it's a bit of a dangerous thing to suggest things, to suggest pathology to patients. But suggesting well-being, I suppose, is all right. We do that all the time and say, well, you will be well. That's a reassuring suggestion. But suggesting symptoms, I would not really advocate, really. Yes.
Right. Thank you, sir. I mean, I've not seen this in the psychiatry, but I've seen that in medical setups. So I always wondered whether this was the correct thing or not. I'm sure the doctors had the best interest of the patient at heart.
Yeah, correct. Yeah,
always doubt, sir. Thank you very much for answering that question.
So thank you very much, sir. So before we wrap up today's proceedings, I would like to remind our dear viewers that the third webinar of Collegia Unitum Scientia with another college will be held in the month of May. I would like to thank Professor Ravin Hangwella, Professor Arashad Disanayak, our president, Dr. Dinesh and Dr. Sudarshan, our secretaries, for all the assistance provided, the AV team at CCP, and of course the attendees for braving the electrical disruptions. Wish you a pleasant evening. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.